Hello and welcome to today's webinar, a look inside a unified data analytics platform. This event is produced by Actual Tech Media, and we're joined by our special guests from Incorta and the Eckerson Group. Thank you so much for joining us on the webinar today. We've got a great event here lined up for you on some really cutting edge enterprise technology. Before we get started, there's just a few things that you should know about the event. First off, my name is David Davis of Actual Tech Media, and I'm glad to be serving as the moderator on the webinar today. As always, we want these events here at Actual Tech Media to be educational, and we encourage your questions there in the questions pane. We'll be dedicating time at the end of the webinar to a live Q&A session where we'll be doing our best to answer all of your questions. We also have a resource there in the handouts tab that I want to call your attention to. That is entitled Getting Started with Incorta. It's there that you can sign up for the Incorta trial and learn more about Incorta. So make sure that you check that resource out, again, in the handouts tab. And then at the end of the webinar, I'll be announcing the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card door prize. Of course, if you're watching this on demand, the drawing has already occurred. The prize terms can be found there in the handouts tab as well. And then additionally, we have a best question prize today for an additional gift card, an Amazon $50 gift card. Of course, you have to ask a question to be entered into the drawing and meet the Actual Tech Media prize terms and conditions. And with that, it's time to kick it off. I'm excited now to bring in our two expert presenters. Welcome first, Mr. Ethan Post. Ethan is the head of Incorta's Pre-Sales Center of Enablement and has been with the company for nearly 3 years. In his time at Incorta, he's worked on solving some of the toughest data and analytics challenges for some of the most recognized brands on the planet. Prior to joining Incorta, he had spent his career as an implementation consultant, focusing on the areas of business intelligence and analytics. It's great to have you on, Joe. I'm also excited to introduce you to Mr. Joe Hilleary, who is a research analyst from the Eckerson Group. Joe is a writer and a data enthusiast. He believes that we're living through a pivotal moment in the evolution of data technology and is dedicated to helping organizations find the best way to leverage their information. At the Eckerson Group, he covers unified data and analytics platforms, or UDAPs, and has authored multiple articles and reports on the topic, including the deep dive on UDAPs and 3 tools to consider, also supporting self-service analytics with a unified platform. Ethan and Joe, it's great to have you on. I'll first hand it off to you, Joe. Take it away.
Hi, David. Thanks so much. Really appreciate the introduction. I'm excited to be with you all here today and to talk about one of my favorite subjects, the Unified Data and Analytics Platform. Since Dave did such a great job with introductions, I'm just going to get right into it. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Eckerson Group, we're a small research and consulting firm covering the data and analytics industry. These are some of our recent consulting clients. You can check out Eckerson.com to see more of our content and research and thought leadership across the data and analytics space. But today we're talking about unified data and analytics platforms. And so I want to start with the why. What's the problem that these platforms seek to address? And this may be a familiar struggle to many of you here today. What we're looking at now is a diagram of the typical workflow for answering an analytics question in a modern enterprise. You have a casual user, a business leader, someone who has a business need. They need an answer to a question. In order to find the answer to that question, the question is passed off to someone who works more directly with the data, someone who we would consider to be a power user. So this might be a data analyst, data scientist, depending on sort of the level of technical expertise needed for a particular question. That persona might vary a little bit. And so they're the ones who are going to go through the data sets, construct an analysis, construct a model, and ultimately deliver an answer. But in order to do that, they need to make sure that they're getting all of the data. And so they're working with a core data team or IT group that's responsible for data infrastructure, integration, pipeline management, right? So you can think about on the top end, we might have someone who looks at dashboards, who makes business decisions. In the middle, we've got someone who's maybe using tools like a data catalog or Python notebooks, someone who is taking data and finding answers out of the data. And then finally, on the bottom layer, we have a team focused around creating that data infrastructure, supporting those two upper layers. And so in order for a particular question to get answered, it really goes through all three layers. First, our business leader asks the question, then our analyst determines what data is needed to answer it. They pass that request for data along to the data team that makes sure they have access to it. Then the data analyst is able to actually look at the data, find the answer, and then they pass it back to the business leader. Now, at each of these handoffs, we see a lot of delays, right? So there are process delays in terms of how these questions actually get passed down. But more than that, there's also technology delays, so friction within these working environments. Often each of these steps requires one or more different tools within the modern data tool stack. So like I said, you might have on one end, the casual user using a BI tool, some sort of visualization. They want to receive a chart or a graphic that has the answer. And so they're familiar with those tools. They might use Excel. Your power user is going to be using any number of different analysis tools, analytics focused software products. And then, of course, your data team is handling a lot more of the infrastructure sides of things. And at each of these stages, we see a slowdown because of the need to integrate between these platforms, the challenges of doing so, having to shift things around in order to make sure that nothing is lost in translation between each of these steps. And so this next graphic is another way of sort of visualizing this hierarchy, if you will, of self-service consumers. So when we talk about self-service, that sort of obfuscates a little bit of the complexity that we really see in the enterprise environment today. At Eckerson Group, we like to talk about 4 different kinds of self-service users. You've got your data consumer, and that's going to be the vast majority of your employees. They use data in their day-to-day jobs, but they're not at the highest level of data literacy. So they're looking at data to make a decision, but they're not necessarily working with the data or doing any sort of analysis. So they're going to be your dashboard consumers, your report consumers. And so when we talk about self-service at that level, that might be the ability to go into a dashboard and look around and find the answer that they want out of 4 or 5 different visualizations that are being delivered for them. A data explorer, we look at that as being about 30% of the workforce at sort of a data-driven organization. These are folks, they're using dashboards, but maybe they have a little bit more nuance. Maybe they can sort of adapt those dashboards, customize them. They're able to go, with a tool like Tableau or Power BI or some of these sort of analytics tools and dig a little bit deeper, but they're still relying on all the data being provided for them within sort of a consumer interface. Your data analyst is a level deeper and sort of the first of what we consider to be those power users, that middle step, right? What a data analyst does exactly can vary a lot. That title we see used for a lot of different roles, but ultimately we think of a data analyst as someone who is taking processed data, right? So not necessarily directly from a source, maybe from a data warehouse, other central repository, and they're conducting the actual analysis, building the final report or dashboard that then is delivered up to the data consumer. Data scientist, obviously this is a persona that we've seen grow a lot in the last decade. They're maybe doing something a little bit deeper, right? So they often require parallel infrastructure to a data analyst. They're using much larger volumes of data, typically to build out ML or AI models. But still, they're ultimately working with the data directly, really digging into it, maybe writing their own code. And finally, all of these are being supported by data infrastructure folks, so data architects, engineers, data curators, who are making sure that each layer has what they need. So when a data scientist says, I need all the data on X, a data curator can say, it's over here, this is how you get it. And a data engineer has built a pipeline that will bring it from the source to where a data scientist or data analyst can access it, be it a warehouse, be it a data lake. So this is sort of the problem we see, right? There's a lot of friction. The time for an analytics project can be on the scale of months, when often the business timelines are a matter of days or weeks, right? If I need an answer in the modern business environment, I need it now. I think in the last couple of years with COVID, we've really seen this need to make data-driven decisions in the moment, right? Things change so quickly now. You can't wait for 3-4 months to get an answer to one of these questions. And so that's why we sort of feel this pain. And then To solve for that, we need to understand this hierarchy of personas, right? All of these different stakeholders within the data environment that need to be supported in order to enable actual self-service. Finally, we layer one more piece of complexity on top, which is the modern data landscape itself. So this is a great graphic. This is from FirstMark, but sort of gives an overview of the kinds of tools that we see in a modern data landscape. And so every year this expands. But you've got tools for data storage, data infrastructure. You've got tools for analytics. You've got tools for business intelligence. You've got all of your communication tools. You've got specialized tools for ML and AI, all of which need to interact with one another. So when I'm talking about multiple tools for each of these steps, it's not atypical to see within one organization 3 or 4 tools, even from the same category, being used by different departments. And so that slows down. If I'm trying to do a holistic analysis that draws on data from finance, but also from sales, that just gums up the works even more, because not only from a process standpoint am I pulling across different parts of my organization, they may be using totally different tools and formats. And so there's a need to try to integrate between these. Okay, so now that we've clearly defined the problem, we're going to talk a little bit about UDAPs, where they come from, and then try to align these two, see what aspects of this problem UDAPs are really able to address. So the Unified Data Analytics Platform is a long time coming. So we sort of see this as the culmination of a couple of decades worth of consolidation of that tool stack we were just looking at. So that diagram looks mostly at point tools. And so that's what we think of as a purpose-built tool, a best-in-breed tool, a software vendor that sets out to do one thing really, really well. And that's sort of an easy starting point for a lot of companies, right? You see a problem, you solve that piece of the problem. And so over time, we saw those evolve into suites of tools, right? So maybe I've got 3 or 4 tools by the same software vendor, each addressing a different piece of the problem. There's some loose integration, but ultimately they're still separate tools. Then in the last decade, we start to see sort of dedicated self-service tools, particularly in the BI analytics space, right? So it's going a little bit further back on the stack. So I've got my visualization component. I've maybe got some querying capabilities, some ability to sort of manipulate the data, all within the same tool. So I can, as long as I've got the data in a form I'm comfortable with, I can finish out the back half of the workflow. And ultimately, we see this enter its final form in the Unified Data Analytics Platform, which adds the back end to all of this. So if we think of the analytics platform as being the visual piece of BI tools, with a semantic layer, interactive dashboards, reporting on one end, we now also have a data platform. So the ability to integrate from sources, data warehouse or data lake functionality, storage, catalogs, glossary, all of these sort of support mechanisms, right? So a unified data analytics platform brings these two into a single platform. And so not only do we have the analytics piece, we have the underlying data piece as well. So it's one tool that all of our self-service personas can use, but also that our underlying support personas can use. And this integration, which we can take a look at it from more of an architectural standpoint here, really brings everyone together. The platform becomes a one-stop shop for all of the data roles across an organization. So this is sort of a generic UDAP architecture. UDAPs came from, we typically think about 3 different origin stories. So you have consolidation over time. So a UDAP created by a vendor who's been in the data industry for decades might have slowly over time stitched together those suites that we talked about into something that's a little bit more cohesively integrated. But ultimately sort of that has its roots in multiple products, and maybe those integrations aren't quite as tight, but it has become one platform over time. We also see a very typical origin would be a point tool that slowly expanded functionality. And so that can kind of come from either end of the stack. There are some that start out as a BI tool, and in order to deliver better analytics capabilities, slowly they build up more and more data capabilities, realizing that the errors start further down the line. We've seen the reverse too. So, a data platform that continues to build out analytics capabilities because they see customers asking for that. And then, accelerate that 3, 4, 5 years, all of a sudden you're doing everything, the full stack within a single platform. And then the final piece is sort of the UDAP by design. And so this tends to be younger companies who are looking to modernize those data landscapes. And so are seeing the problem that I've just described with fragmentation of the data landscape, sort of the proliferation of all these tools and going, that's a pain. Small to mid-sized businesses can't handle that. Even large enterprises are really struggling with the overhead, with the integrations. There's got to be a better way, and sort of building out a UDAP as a UDAP from the beginning. But in all the cases, regardless of where it comes from, these are sort of the defining characteristics. Right? We've got some level of data connectivity and ingestion, some level of data storage with management and infrastructure, and then some level of analytics. So a place where self-service users can come at varying levels and either access their dashboards, build reports, or build models. And so you can see on one side, we're connecting to data sources. On the other side, we're connecting to all varieties of business users. And so why do we see UDAPs as a potential solution to the problem I've just described? Well, it can sort of solve two problems really well. And the first case is for a company that's just starting out with data analytics. It might be a startup. It might be a company that's just getting into analytics, realizing the value of their data. It might even be a department, a larger organization that just hasn't really done analytics before, but sort of a greenfield use case. And so I think what we see with this particular scenario is a UDAP is a great way to sort of get started fast. Rather than having to evaluate and purchase multiple tools, you can start with a single platform that allows that end-to-end functionality from the very beginning. And the other case that we see is simplifying complexity. And so that's where you already have this data environment that's massively complex, and you want to start trying to bring that under control, simplify and unify. And so because it has functionality across all those different pieces, bringing a UDAP can allow you to slowly replace over time. And a key piece of this that I haven't really touched on yet is most UDAPs are fairly extensible. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit too. But they can integrate into your existing environment and serve as a central piece. And then over time, you can determine which features you need or don't need and sort of pair those off from your existing platforms, replacing them with the native capabilities of the UDAP. But at this point, I want to pivot over to Ethan. Now that I've sort of introduced this big concept and a couple of the main applications here, I'd like to open it up and kind of engage in more of a conversation here. So Ethan, I'd love to hear kind of how this concept resonates with Incorta and sort of seeing where Incorta came from, right? So those origin stories, problems that you've seen actually implementing.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So you mentioned kind of the origins of the UDAP space, and the founders of Incorta actually came from Oracle for the most part, right? So very steeped in kind of the siloed data architecture where, hey, Oracle is one of the top database providers in the world. They obviously have their own BI stack and ETL tools, but in reality, there's no organization under the sun that's running up, purely Oracle, BI and analytics stack, right? So it's interesting to think that our founders came from a world of, basically point solutions or best of breed technology to building Incorta specifically to solve a lot of the problems you talk through. And it's funny, I have a lot of responsibilities in both what we call like our mid-market accounts and enterprise. And I think they kind of neatly fit into these two boxes you have here, right? So I love working with organizations who are just starting down that path of becoming more data-driven, because they really come in with eyes wide open of, hey, we'd love to have one holistic solution that kind of checks all the boxes. But on the other end, we work with some of the largest companies in the world and say, hey, there's certain analytical challenges just due to data complexity, data silos, or others that they just can't solve with legacy or traditional technology. So having an all-in-one package allows you to be a lot more precise, but also a lot more flexible in terms of the solutions that you provide. So I love the way that you laid out a lot of this information.
Thanks, Ethan. Yeah. And I think that's something we hear sort of across the board anytime we talk the two extremes for a UDAP. It's kind of interesting that same approach has a lot of value on both ends of the spectrum. Yeah. And the reason for that, of course, is kind of getting back to this workflow idea, right? If we can bring everyone together, we can create natural synergies in terms of both process and technology. And so when we talk about a UDAP housing this entire workflow, now even the lines of communication can often happen within the platform. I can submit requests or link to dashboards in the same tool where I'm doing my data integration and bringing things in from different sources. And so we see sort of both reduced friction on the integration standpoint, right? I'm not trying to make all of these different tools play nice with each other, but also on the process side, right? There's sort of the natural flow of data from one end, the source, to the final business decision, and it can all happen in one place. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this diagram as well, Ethan. I'd be interested to see if this aligns with some of the practices you've seen.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that kind of jumps off the page is just the complexity, right? The many players and the many different parts of this process that have to happen in an orchestrated fashion to make things work, right? So that's where, I mean, what initially drew me to the world of UDAPs and why I actually kind of agreed to work for Incorta is the simplification of this process, right? Taking all these various components and putting them under kind of one umbrella in one, all-encompassing platform just makes a lot of sense, right? It makes that orchestration, makes the communication a lot easier. So again, love the way that you kind of laid this out. And like there's certain components of this that are harder than others that I think you definitely touched upon.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's for sure. This, I think, can sometimes make it seem like all these elements are equal, but certainly more time is taken up at different stages of this. So that's a good point to make there, Ethan. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Now, of course, you may be thinking, well, that's great, but I really like the tools I use. I don't want to replace everything. Surely there are aspects of this that can be addressed in other ways. And so I think it's important to talk about, there are multiple ways to address the same problem. Nothing is a silver bullet, and UDAPs are a really great way to address certain aspects of this problem. But sort of the alternative to UDAP, if we sort of think of it as a spectrum of, on one hand, I'm going to do everything on a single platform versus I'm going to do everything on all kinds of platforms, one tool for each piece. There are other ways to sort of unify a little bit. And so when we talk about a best in breed approach, trying to use all these point tools, we see sort of the alternative as the use of an orchestration tool. And so an orchestration tool isn't providing any particular functionality in terms of the data itself, but it is coordinating between all of these different data tools. So you might have data sources that are connecting directly to each of the tools in the stack, right? So your data is flowing through a bunch of independent tools, and then an orchestration tool is connecting those, managing those data flows between different pieces of the stack. Now, there are pros and cons to both of these approaches. So, when we talk about the UDAP, the big thing is it is just one platform. And so if we're talking about that greenfield application, it's much faster startup time. I've talked with organizations that, not huge organizations, small to mid-sized businesses that were able to get a data and analytics initiative up and going with just a couple of people, neither of whom were particularly technical, because of sort of the ease of use of some of these platforms. The fact you're only dealing with one tool. You just have to set it up once, and you've got 80% of the functionality you could ever want. But that is the trade-off, right? So we talk about UDAPs are a little bit of a jack of all trades, right? We're doing everything in the stack, but we're maybe not doing every step with all of the bells and whistles. And so that's where we sort of see that best in breed piece, right? Maybe you have a tool that you're already using and your team really likes, and there's some really niche functionality that only that tool has. And so an orchestration-oriented approach allows you to do that. On the UDAP side, again, as much as you can reduce the number of tools you're using, you're also reducing the number of subscriptions and contracts. And ultimately with UDAP, you're reducing architectural complexity. The underlying infrastructure becomes consolidated. Whereas with orchestration, you're managing that complexity, but you're actually just adding one more layer on top. So with these two pieces, there's not a right answer. And sort of putting them in this way, I think is a bit of a misnomer, because it's really, like I said, a spectrum. So it's very rare that we would see an organization that only uses a UDAP for all of this. And it's very rare that we would see an orchestration tool that provides no native functionality. It's better to actually think about this as a sliding spectrum, where these are platforms that are highly extensible. And so, I might be using my UDAP kind of like an orchestration tool. If I already have a very complicated environment and I'm integrating with a bunch of tools, but the UDAP gives me a central place to take a look at where all of my data is and who's dealing with it. It can be a centralization piece, and I may not really even be using a lot of the native functionality for analytics. I might have other tools I like for that, and I just use the UDAP to bring them together. Orchestration tools, they tend to have fewer actual data tools built into them, but sometimes they do have occasional bits and pieces where they say, you know what, actually, if you want to do ETL here too, we'll do that. And so, it's better to think of these as two poles on a spectrum as opposed to diametrically opposed approaches. And with that, I think that sort of wraps up what I was hoping to get to today. Hopefully it gives you a better sense of sort of what we're talking about when we talk about a UDAP, why you might want to use them, what sorts of scenarios they're particularly effective at addressing, and sort of what the alternatives are, pros and cons. Ethan, I welcome any comments you might have on this last slide, sort of that comparison between orchestration and UDAP.
Yeah, so I think one thing, that I always hear, obviously I'm a salesman and I sell Incorta day in and day out. So it's always interesting where, we go into an account that may have an existing tech stack or maybe evaluating other tools. And one of the first questions that'll be asked is, okay, before we even get started, like, who are your competitors? What do you compare to? And it's difficult to say, we compare to cloud data warehouse vendors or visualization tools, because in reality, the UDAP space is in direct competition with kind of that, what I'll call the legacy approach, which you've labeled here as the kind of that orchestration method. So that is one key thing I think for the audience to understand is we're not saying that, Incorta or UDAP is better than Tableau, right? Because that's not a fair comparison. It's basically comparing almost apples to oranges and saying in some cases, there's trade-offs to be made and one might be advantageous over the other.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point to sort of reiterate that the UDAP is addressing so many different segments of the larger data market, right? Like it is providing a data warehouse or data lake, that storage centralized solution. It is providing the analytics, the BI piece. Often it's providing some sort of ML capability as well, in addition to data integration, in addition to visualization. And so, doing many things very well as opposed to doing one thing extraordinarily well, it's a trade-off, and there might be different scenarios where one approach makes more sense than the other. And that's where that extensibility piece, I think, really comes in.
Yeah, well said.
All right. And I'll go ahead and hand it over to you, Ethan. I know you've got a demo in store for us, so we can take a look at some of these things on the ground within an actual UDAP.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the idea. So before I kind of get there, I think one thing that I wanted to call out, obviously, Joe and the Eckerson group, I think, do a great job of providing thought leadership in the space. And a lot of, I'd say, the more kind of academic approaches to the pros and cons of both, I would definitely defer to him, right? I try to be objective here, and my background comes from basically a practitioner in what I consider like the legacy BI value chain, now having moved over to Incorta and fully adopting this concept of a UDAP. But what I want to talk through, I think, is a little bit more tactically in terms of what Incorta and what I see in the field day in and day out, and then actually diving into the platform to kind of put a face to the name when it comes to what is a UDAP and what kind of features and functions are available that kind of tie all this value together, right? So here you see a couple of taglines, right? Analytic applications in days, which I'll be talking through here shortly, but answers to complex questions in seconds. So there's really two main value drivers that I see for UDAPs in general, but also more specifically to Incorta is you have business users who just need to be able to answer and access difficult questions, right? On the other end, you have IT folks who have historically been the bottleneck and sometimes carry the burden of the bad guy when it comes to getting data in the hands of end users, just given the technical complexity of that legacy ecosystem. So I kind of lay out this slide as a good way to just describe the why, as Joe's already called out, which is you look at the old way and the new way, which I'll kind of call the Incorta way, right? In that old way, we started the same end user, right? The end user that I kind of always maintain focus on, who just wants to be able to answer questions. And say they have a question, step number one for any user, I'm sure on the other end of this line is, who do you talk to? You probably talk to a centralized BI team, maybe your IT counterpart, to get a request in the queue and say, hey, I need this type of data. I need to be able to answer this question. What's that going to take? Queue, months, maybe weeks worth of work to get that queue into process, getting new data built into maybe something like an existing data warehouse or data processor value chain, then transforming that data, landing it in something like a data mart, building your pipeline into a BI or technology tool, and finally, giving an end user access to be able to answer that question here. And again, this could be weeks, this could be months, sometimes this could be days, but there is always a lead time from asking a question to getting an answer in that legacy value chain. And the biggest thing here is, hey, as soon as an end user is able to answer that question, what's the inevitable next step, right? They're going to ask another question. They become more data curious, and it's difficult in what I call the old way to feed that data curiosity. So honestly, the impetus for Incorta and the reason why we're even a company is because we recognize that and wanted to create a new way to allowing business users to answer questions. Basically, starting with that same end user down in that second graphic, but giving them access to all their data in full fidelity, full transactional visibility, and saying, hey, here, have at it, right? In a very self-service fashion. And hopefully what I'm saying kind of, sounds too good to be true, sounds like I'm promising a lot, because the idea here is I'd love to kind of show that in real time. So if I dive deeper, when I really talk about the why, it's how did we kind of get here? I look at that traditional data pipeline, and a lot of the tools and processes that Joe had called out are kind of outlined here. And frankly, this might even be overly simplistic, because when I look at all the source data systems that end users have had to access throughout time, right? Be these cloud, be these on-prem databases, enterprise applications, big data streaming, you name them, right? Inevitably, the first step is, okay, we have to buy an ETL tool that we can hook up to those data sources and land it somewhere. Maybe this would be something like a data staging area, which historically Hadoop may have taken the place of. Sometimes this might land directly in your data warehouse. From there, you might have additional ETL processes or jobs that transform that data and turn it into a more business-ready, application-ready format, right? So here we're talking about data warehouses, and the legacy approach to a data warehouse is these might be kind of siloed or vertical by department, by business unit, or you might have one enterprise data warehouse that is kind of a conglomeration of all that data. But on the right-hand side, here's kind of your business tools, right? So I'm calling out things like business objects, IBM Cognos, which I know there's a question about earlier. So frankly, these are tools that I consider, in association with the legacy approach, although there's certainly users that are still getting value out of them, right? And that's not to say that this legacy approach or legacy value chain is wrong, but certainly we're calling out the many steps and the many tools and platforms that are required to run this process end to end. And invariably, the amount of lead time from asking a question to getting an answer has to go through each and every one of these steps, right? So fast forward from maybe the early 2000s to maybe the late teens, or even to a couple of years ago to currently, we talk about a modern data pipeline. Certainly, there's a ton of new tools on the market that provide a lot of new functionality and features. So if you look at this kind of modern data pipeline or modern data chain, you still have this concept of an ETL, but maybe rather than using legacy tools, you're leveraging something like a Matillion or Fivetran to pull data and transform it into something like a data warehouse or data staging area, which in the current kind of modern stack is likely going to take the shape of a data lake. Data lakes are amazing for storing data, and obviously there's a ton of good use cases for this. A lot of organizations tend to use these incorrectly in the long term in order to kind of just get things up and running, right? From here, a lot of times we're pushing data to a data warehouse. And here's where I think a lot of the focus has been on in recent years in the innovation that's being driven, right? So you have something like a Snowflake, which is amazingly oriented for cloud, right? Easily scalable, offers kind of a low-code approach to data warehousing in a lot of cases. But there's a lot of other tools out there. My argument here would be, even from something like a cloud data warehouse pushing to a modern visualization tool like a Tableau or Power BI, I'm just kind of laying out the current modern data space. There's a lot of tools there that are oriented for some nice features in terms of where data and analytics are going. But if you think about this, we're still looking at kind of a siloed approach, right? So a lot of organizations are still breaking this out by business unit, by vertical. And I'd say the proliferation of these cloud data warehouse tools makes it even easier for your product or your marketing team to have a different data warehouse or data storage layer than your finance team, because frankly, it's easy enough to almost transact via credit card at first and say, hey, we need a solution. We're going to procure this and get it up and running, right? I'd say the other thing I'll call out here is that the proliferation of the modern data stack has almost given a rise to an entirely new industry, which is focused on things like data governance, data lineage, data cataloging, and others. So now you have tools like Elation and Calibra out there that are key to a modern data organization, giving you visibility from that Tableau report that your end users are seeing, all the way back to, hey, what field is this coming out of in my source system? What changes have had to happen along the way? And basically putting all that into business speak to give end users visibility, right? So there's a lot that goes into it. And honestly, here's where I would pause, because frankly, I'll fully admit the my difficulty in maintaining objectivity, because frankly, I'm a huge component or a proponent of the UDAP and Incorta, right? So I'll kind of turn it over to Joe and just say, hey, broad strokes, is this a fair comparison to make from that legacy to the modern approach? And is there anything you think I may have missed or any oversights in what I just talked through?
Yeah, Ethan, I mean, these are a couple of great slides, and you pull some good examples out here. But I'd say sort of the biggest shift that we see between the legacy and the modern data landscape, right? There's sort of two macro trends. One is the cloud, right? This need to sort of move things off premises for greater flexibility and for greater scalability, which is really the other piece too. The scale of data we're dealing with now is very different than the scale we were dealing with in the 90s, right? When we were sort of looking at maybe some of these early legacy tools starting to emerge. So, whereas once I might be dealing mostly with proprietary internal data coming from a handful of source systems, now, the modern enterprise is dealing with huge volumes of data just at an unprecedented scale. So there's the big data piece, there's the cloud piece. And so we need different tools to handle that volume and to handle those environments. But that doesn't mean our old tools went away, right? So when we talk about technical debt, if I'm a company that's been doing data, been doing analytics for a while, I've got a bunch of tools in different departments, and I keep buying new ones because there are new problems coming up, but I don't get rid of the old ones. And so that's where we see sort of this massive expansion and the increasing complexity of these pipelines, right? Most people are not a pure hybrid company, pure cloud company as much as they want to be, right? Most people are still living in a hybrid environment. They're doing some things on-prem, they're doing some things in the cloud. They've got different tool stacks in both in order to manage those workloads. And so, yeah, I mean, what we see is different technologies in the pipeline, but still the fundamental, macro level view is the same. I'm trying to take data from some source. I want to move it somewhere, change it around a little bit so that I can use it to answer a question, right? I mean, I think that's the thing. Sometimes we get into data infrastructure, we lose sight. The end goal of data is always to make a decision, right? Either that's something automated that's happening through ML or AI, or that's a business level decision that a human is looking at a dashboard or a graphic and having to make a call. And that's the real value of data. Data by itself is not valuable. Data is valuable when we put it to a use. And that hasn't changed. That fundamental is the same, but the kinds of data and the tools needed to deal with that data are what have changed. Yeah, I hope that answers your question there, Ethan.
It definitely does. I think that's a really good point, right? We're not talking about data for data's sake. And I think the other thing to call out here is like, what is really the origin of the data warehouse and why things have kind of oriented themselves towards this this process, either via the legacy or the modern approach. And honestly, the way that I typically describe this, and business users sometimes don't understand this, but I think it's key to understand, is basically solving what I call the join problem, right? So the data warehouse was created when it was created because applications or tools at the time had no ability to, say, transact or query across even probably 5, 6, 10 tables at a time. So the problem that Encoder is honestly solving at its core is what I call the join problem. But the value that unlocks is the ability to basically honestly do away with a lot of the legacy tools and approaches and create a more unified approach to pulling data from a source system and serving up insights for users, right? So that's kind of I'd say the beginning and end of that process. And when Encoder is done is crash that cycle to allow you to basically get from point A to point B very, very quickly. So what is Encoder, right? We've kind of talked about the why, but what is Encoder is we're a modern unified data analytics platform that crashes that course. And honestly, I kind of break this up into 3 kind of separate buckets, right? So data ingestion is a key thing to understand because very dissimilarly from what I had just shown in that legacy or even the modern approach, Encoder is connecting those data sources, pulling all your data in full transactional fidelity. So what does that mean for a business user? It means I now have access to all of my transaction line, finite granular data to make decisions. I don't have to settle for summarized data sets, right? That data query engine, I think, is super important to understand because what I'm saying is we're now at a time where that join problem is solved. And Encoder solves that problem by saying, I don't care if it's 10, 20, 30 tables and billions of records. Encoder and our direct data mapping query engine underneath the hood is what allows you to basically traverse to that kind of scale and that kind of performance in sub-seconds. So that's a key thing to understand. And then the unified nature of the platform is insights, right? How does an end user answer a question? We have our own pre-built or inbuilt technology stack that allows you to create dashboards and visualizations within the tool itself. but also allowing for things like data science via embedded Spark and notebooks, right? So that unification is not necessarily just serving up data and allowing end users to, kind of go nuts with it. It's a very structured kind of formulated process to allowing that kind of end user self-service. And I think the other thing I'll call out is the how, right? So I've kind of talked about the what is Incorta doing, but if I dive one layer deeper into those three buckets, right? Data ingestion means we can connect out to 30 plus sources natively with connectors that we built over the years. We also have partnerships with organizations that allow us to connect, I think, 250 plus sources, right? So there's been a lot of questions in the chat around, hey, do you connect to this? Do you connect to that? I'll just say kind of broadly, I've not worked with a single source at Incorta in my time here that we cannot extract data from one way or another. So whether it's our inbuilt tools, whether it's our partnerships that allow us to pull data in, certainly I'd say most sources, if not all, are kind of on the table there. And then this middle layer, that direct data mapping query engine, is what allows you to get that scalability up to the billions of records, 10, 20, 30 table joins. And to me, that's the real differentiator, right? That's where organizations start to say, wow, the approach is really different. And when we compare kind of that legacy approach to Incorta, we're really crashing the cycle of getting data in the hands of end users, which is that far right bucket. How do we provide self-service for any number of users, right? Be these data consumers, be these data analysts, or true power users that really want to ask and answer their own questions. So again, that's kind of the how, right? The technology under the hood that truly is game changing and provides that disruption. But on top of that, sometimes I'll call this kind of our supercharger, right? So Incorta by itself is a truly groundbreaking platform in that context of a unified data analytics platform. But mixed with this concept that we call a blueprint is what really gives Incorta a ton of power, because when you think about complex systems like modern ERPs, CRMs, or basically any other tool, the source system complexity is what a lot of that modern process is built out to completely do away with, right? Incorta says, bring all that complexity on. We're willing to handle it head on. And frankly, these blueprints are basically a prepackaged application. So we didn't invent the packaged application per source system or for analytic use case, but I think we certainly have perfected it, right? So what I'd love to do is take, maybe 10 minutes, maybe a little bit less here due to time, just to kind of talk through what a blueprint is in the context of Incorta and that unified data analytics platform. But hopefully this also helps kind of answer some of that question or demystify what a unified data analytic platform is to begin with. So if I just dive into Incorta, I'd love to just kind of analyze this through the lens of that end user who has business questions and needs to get answers. So if you look at the screen I'm showing right now, this is the Incorta platform, right? So I'm logged into this instance. I'm on my home tab and I can start to basically navigate amongst the platform. Content is where I'd create, store, and organize dashboards. And you can see I've actually already brought in what we call our Salesforce blueprint. So you can see we have coverage from a dashboard perspective for areas like sales, finance, and marketing. We also, on the back end, I can show you we've connected out to that Salesforce instance and just brought in all that raw transactional data. So be these leads, opportunities, accounts, or any other table from that complex system. And Salesforce, I would say, is a good example because they provide some of the industry-leading APIs, and they're a great data source that, frankly, most modern organizations either have or are looking into, right? So if I'm a business user, I don't have to settle for that complexity because inside of Incorta, we've also built this semantic layer that truly orients us to that end user self-service, right? So for those same subject areas I just talked through, an end user who's interested in building something for sales can look at kind of this combined curated data set and say, look, I don't need to know the 30 tables and that certain fields come from my lead table where others come from opportunity. I can curate and organize that data set in a way that end users can easily understand. But kind of I'd say the icing on top of the cake is the fact that we have these pre-built dashboards and analytics. So if I'm a sales executive, I can come in and within a single platform, not only connect out to bring in that raw transactional data and curate it for end user consumption, but I can create and store dashboards that maybe an analyst or a data consumer wants to just come out and take a look at, right? So I can look at Salesforce data in the context of a sales executive showing me things like pipeline, quarter to date, year to date sales metrics, and so on and so forth. But again, when I mention that finite transactional granularity, here's what you're getting, right? All that fine detail down below. But the other cool thing is, if I'm that sales executive who kind of wants to roll up my sleeves and start to ask additional questions, maybe I have something like total bookings by opportunity region, where I can say drill into the US and start to look at opportunities only within this region. But maybe I want to actually ask a different question, right? Maybe I'm not interested particularly in a region. Maybe I want to look at my entire customer base and analyze bookings by something like industry. This is where that concept of an end user having a question and being able to quickly get an answer comes into play. Because again, they don't necessarily need to know that, hey, that industry field actually comes from the account table, whereas total bookings is going to be a join out to my opportunities. It's basically this process of dragging and dropping and creating this immersive self-service experience where, okay, now I've taken this insight and I've actually layered upon that region, different industries in which I do business, right? So now if I search for construction, my sales executive has the ability to say, okay, well, now I can look at win rates for opportunities in construction. Maybe I want to look particularly at new opportunities, right? New logo opportunities. And I can continue to drill in and basically refine that search. But keep in mind, the whole value here in the context of what we're looking at is the beauty of going from raw data to transactional complexity and answering questions basically on the fly for any end user. So that's one scenario, right? That might be an end user who has complex business questions, wants to get answers from a source system that's already been ingested. The other thing I'll call out is if I'm an end user and say I run something like NetSuite as my ERP, right? If I have proper permissions, I can come in here and install a brand new blueprint on the fly that says, okay, well, I'm going to select that Incorta demo cluster, go ahead and make sure I throw it in the same tenant that we're looking at. And now in a couple of clicks, rather than having to go through that orchestrated process of ETLs, data warehouse, data staging layers, and so on and so forth, I can just basically imprint that blueprint and all the complexity that comes with it in real time, right? So that's what's happening behind the scenes as I kind of run this process. And this is just to give a great example of not only what Incorta can do in terms of just applying that transactional complexity and giving end users self-service, it's how quickly can it be done, right? One of the main benefits that you get in that UDAP solution is the ability to go from raw data to insights in no time. So you can see here, I've now brought in this NetSuite Blueprints folder that gives me everything from, again, executive dashboards to finance, sales order, operations and purchasing, and HR. But I also have this middle curated layer that we call a business schema, where I've kind of put all this complex ERP data into business speak, right? So if I look at something like this common curated layer, I can look at the core criteria that someone might want to use or a particular date view, right? And this is what kind of translates that extreme complexity of that source system to a model that an end user can understand and build upon. In addition to that, right, I have a set of schemas that I brought in, right? So everything from accounting to entities to all the transaction detail. And the big thing to understand here is that I have a connection out to that NetSuite instance, right? So I understand we likely have a fairly technical audience on the other side of this call. And the beauty of this is we have a pre-built NetSuite connector that basically allows me to pull that in. And if I wanted to, say, switch NetSuite instances and load data from another source, we could easily do that, right? So when I talk about that unified data analytics platform, this all-in-one package is what allows an end user to go all the way from all this raw kind of transactional data to insights. And you can see that as I've been talking here, we've actually loaded all this data in real time. And in a second or two here, what you're going to see is now all the transactions that we pulled in, right around, I think, 200,000 transactions or so, are going to be loaded into this Encoder platform. And all these joins and raw complexity that is inherent in that underlying ERP source system is going to be basically scalable and available for analytics on the front end, right? So if I go ahead and navigate over to my content tab, I'm just going to wrap things up real quickly by showing an example of that. This blueprint that I've just deployed in no time flat, that gives me visibility into a super complex business process. So if I'm a complex business that runs, a complex purchase order to bill payment process where I just want to look at that P2P cycle, right? How many purchase orders do we have outstanding? Oh, excuse me, that's the wrong dashboard. If I look at my procure to pay overview, right, where I just want to see that P2P process of basically issuing a purchase order and paying my vendors, all of a sudden I've now thrown all that into this Encoder instance, all that raw transactional fidelity, which gives me the ability to come in and start to really analyze the data, right? So if I want to look at something like, okay, well, who's my top vendor type inside my NetSuite instance? Select that vendor type. Now all of a sudden I can look at all the vendors underneath that particular vendor type and start to drill in here. And maybe I want to dive deeper into Canon, which seems to be my top vendor for that vendor type photographic equipment. The interesting thing is, in no time flat with absolutely no coding whatsoever, I have the ability to view all purchase orders, of which I've issued 16 over time, all item receipts, of which there have been 15, right? Bill issues and payments. And what I can do really, really quickly here is say, okay, well, I've paid this vendor $913,298. I've been billed for that exact same amount, and I've actually received items in the same amount over time, right? But one thing I'll call out here on the purchase order list is this is actually a higher value because I do have one outstanding purchase order that's yet to be fulfilled. So if you kind of think about that process of going from raw data to insights in, honestly, 2 to 3 minutes here, think about the various hops and the various tools that we'd have to go through in that legacy approach and how easy that is to do in Incorta. So obviously these are some source systems with which we have a lot of experience and content built out for. But frankly, this is kind of a theme throughout the course of Incorta is we take these highly complex systems and allow end users to make a lot of sense of these systems in basically no time flat, right? So what I'd love to do is kind of end this with a bit of a call to action and saying, now that you've seen a short demo in which we've basically gone from raw data to insights in minutes, I'd love for y'all to kind of, take a spin and try this out yourself, right? So if you go out to that same instance that I was just on, at cloud.incorta.com/sign up, you can actually create your own Incorta trial instance today that I think lasts for around 30 days. And any kind of, extremely complex analytical challenges that you or your business are facing, I would challenge you to bring those to the Encoder platform and see whether or not that's something that can be solved, right? Because our ability to cut out a lot of the complexity and the orchestration of the old legacy process is what really drives us towards answering those business questions very quickly. So again, that's kind of the call to action. And frankly, if you can take anything from my side of this presentation, I'd urge you to try it out yourself, right? I made a lot of bold claims and hopefully kind of back those up here in a short amount of time. But when the light bulb really clicks on is when folks can see their data in Incorta answering questions to which they've never been able to get answers. So at this time, David, I'll kind of turn it back over to you. I know we have a ton of great questions coming in through the live stream. So I'd love if we can dive into any of those that we have time for here.
Absolutely. Yeah, we got a lot of great questions. Thank you everyone out there for the excellent questions. I'll go ahead and just get started with this one from Kelly, who's asking, how specifically does Incorta defeat the Humpty Dumpty problem, also known as the fragmentation problem?
Yeah, I love that question. Now, I kind of love the terminology too, which I might actually steal. But when I think of the data fragmentation and the data silos that have been created, it's because the rise of microservices and the ability to stand up a Salesforce instance in a couple of months. It's your dedicated CRM, but then also have a dedicated billing, a dedicated quoting system. That in and of itself kind of creates this data silo effect. And the beauty of Incorta is pulling in all that data in its raw transactional fidelity, not changing the data from the source at all, is what allows you to quickly create joins from multiple systems that tie things together. So I know there's been additional questions of, hey, what customers are you solving this for? Can you give me a real world use case? And I'd say a great use case that I hear all the time is this concept of bookings, billings, and backlogs. So I have a booking system, maybe like my CRM. I have a separate billing system, maybe like Zora or something else. And then my backlog might be my ERP or maybe a warehouse management system, right? Where I'm actually tracking orders and when they get shipped out. So the beauty of that is Incorta can bring all that data into a single platform, but then stitch it together and join throughout all those various systems very easily, because we're not having to build these huge star schemas with conformed, dimensions and facts. We're able to leverage that underlying data to really quickly kind of unify those sources together and answer some really, really complex business problems that scale multiple systems. So I hope that's a good enough answer. If not, certainly I'm available for follow-ups.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great answer. Next question. This one I think is for you, Joe. Chris is asking, what makes for a good or great unified data analytics platform? And does it depend on the type of data that the platform is analyzing?
This is a really great question, Chris. And I mean, the short answer is it kind of depends on what you're trying to do with it. And so it's maybe better to think of this question sort of in terms of what are the different elements that you should evaluate as you're trying to find a good match and looking at different UDAPs. And so, yes, the type of data is a big part of it. So think about sort of what your sources are. Obviously, you want to make sure that your UDAP connects to the data sources that you use in your business. That's kind of a big one. But I don't think it'd be overstated. I mean, it's great to say we want to unify all of our data. If the platform that you purchased doesn't connect to your data sources, you're going to have a hard time doing that. One of the other pieces you want to look at is sort of the technical depth needed to use the platform. So some focus a little bit more on a consumer grade user interface, which makes it a lot more approachable for business users getting on the platform, but might be frustrating for your traditional ETL developers, people who do a lot of SQL writing. And so finding a balance there that meets the needs of your organizations is going to be really key. Often we see when you're sort of building out pipelines within a UDAP, there's the ability to embed scripts or to embed custom SQL. And so those are some features you might want to look for if that's something that you really value. And then the big piece we've sort of mentioned a couple times is this idea of extensibility, right? And so this is similar to the source question. But if there are tools that you are using that you want to continue using, but you want to use a UDAP as sort of your centralization platform, you want to make sure that it plays nice with those tools. And so that's going to be sort of a specific UDAP question. So as you look at each of them, oh, and the other big piece, of course, is the environment itself. So we see UDAPs that are entirely in the cloud, some that are hybrid, some that operate on-prem. And so again, this is a preference thing. This is matching the solution to your business needs, to the needs of your specific organization. But that's another question you want to ask. Like, where does the UDAP live? What are the kinds of sources it's dealing with? Where do the outputs go? In terms of whether you're keeping it on-prem, whether you're operating in a hybrid environment, or whether you want to put everything on the cloud. So I hope that's helpful, Chris. It's not a straight answer, but those are sort of the elements you want to evaluate. And at the end of the day, it's really going to be a matching process between your business and a particular solution.
Excellent. Yeah, wise advice. Thank you, Joe. Let's see. Here's another question actually from Chris. Maybe this one's for you, Ethan. He's saying that their challenge is really around performance and the time it takes to analyze historical data. Could Incorta help with that challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think historical data is an interesting thing to bring up because I think there's, in the simplest terms, right? I want to be able to access all my data from the beginning of time to do things like inception to date reporting, right? So Incorta allows for that. And as I mentioned, 10, 20, 30 table joins are commonplace inside of Incorta, and I wouldn't call it out if it scared me. But also, scale to the billions and billions of records, right? So if the challenge is that you can't basically scale up your visualization tools to handle that type of volume, certainly I could show you that in a matter of probably 5 to 10 minutes that hopefully would alleviate those types of concerns. The other challenge in historical reporting is, how do I do snapshotting, right? It's not enough that I can see inception today, and I need to see things like slowly changing dimensions, or I need to be able to analyze point-in-time reporting. That's another great case for a unified data analytics platform, right? Because without having to go through all those steps in the value chain, we're actually able to do snapshotting directly from the source, right? So I'd call that out as like an advanced feature that Incorta allows. But frankly, when I hear the word performance and when I hear the word historical data, in the back of my head, those are always good signs for maybe even evaluating a unified data analytics platform that might be a little bit more performant, which Incorta certainly is over legacy tools.
Excellent. Well, it looks like we're running out of time here in our live Q&A, I'm afraid, because there's a ton of great questions still out there, but I want to respect everyone's time here in the hour. So last question I wanted to ask you, Ethan, that is just so if folks go out to cloud.incorta.com, they sign up, can you kind of just walk us through like what happens next?
Yeah, so that's kind of the nice thing is, we are very cloud focused, right? We understand that most organizations are also, that's tops on their IT roadmap, right? So we've tried to build an experience that is as intuitive as possible, which has a nice, we call it our Schema Wizard or our Data Wizard that allows you to connect out to your systems, bring your data in. The other cool thing that we have is a ton of documentation and community that kind of help you get up and running quickly. But don't be surprised if you see my face in the bottom right-hand corner there offering chat or live support, because that's the other thing we're huge on, right? We want to be able to make sure that as folks come in and have questions to ask and answer, they don't have to wait a week to do it, right? So feel free to interact in that way too. And that's a good way that we can actually kind of keep you going or get you up and running quickly.
Excellent. All right. Yeah, it sounds like a great opportunity for folks out there to help, utilize a unified data analytics platform to overcome some of these challenges they're facing around data. This has been a great event. I really enjoyed seeing Incorta in action. I really enjoyed learning a lot from you, Joe, about UDAP systems, how they work, what to know about them, and the challenges that companies need to be aware of. So Ethan and Joe, thank you so much for being on the webinar today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
And thank you to everyone out there in the audience for all the excellent questions. We'll be doing our best to respond to these electronically. Before we go, I want to announce the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card. This is going to Tom Okai from California. Congratulations. We'll also reach out to our best question prize winner. And of course, I want to encourage everyone to go to cloud.incorta.com and sign up for Incorta. Try it out for yourself. Thank you to everyone who joined us on the webinar today. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.